Good evening, everybody. It's nice to be with a couple of friends on a nice temperate night in Asheville, North Carolina. Thank you all so much for joining us. This is the final event of our Spring Common Word, which is a community curated book experience here at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. Every semester, we, and by we, I mean me, choose a text, and I try to bring the community, the campus, our friends, our students together around a single text. And this semester, our text is The Other Dr. Gilmer by Dr. Benjamin Gilmer, who is here with us tonight. Our text, I'll go ahead and let the cat out of the bag. Our text for the fall is going to be I Came as a Shadow, which is the autobiography of Coach John Thompson, who was the longtime coach of the Georgetown Hoyas. It's a fascinating book about race and culture and college athletics, college politics. We don't know anything about that here in the state of North Carolina, right? Only the good stuff about athletics. And so I'll be releasing information about that. You can always find out more about the Common Word if you go to unca.edu/Common Word. I post essays, interviews, reviews, a reading guide, all kinds of information. So look for the information about John Thompson's book at some point this summer. There will also be a list of events. The Common Word began about maybe 2 years ago during the pandemic. We were having the events virtually, which meant it was myself in the audience and Kevin, who was doing the live stream. And we moved them up here to Ollie thinking, Ollie folks are an engaged audience. It's an automatic, built-in engaged audience, and that has certainly been true. Some of you are like, yeah, we are engaged. And we are built. We are built. And so, you know, this project, this series has certainly gathered some inertia. These events are now very, very well attended. And I have no doubt it's due in part to inertia, but it's also due to great books like The Other Dr. Gilmer, which many of you probably have read. If you have not, there are copies available. Yes. There are copies available in the lobby for purchase, and Benjamin's willing to sign after the event this evening if you would like your book signed. But the success of this event is also due, of this series is also due to some of the great speakers that we had. In the beginning of the semester, we had Dr. Laura Meadows. She gave a very interesting lecture on the ethics of the true crime genre. And you know who that's for. Some of you are like, I love true crime, but I feel kind of uncomfortable about it. How do I square my interests with what it means to like it at the same time? And then Professor Laura Jones gave a fantastic lecture about the evolution of mental illness in the criminal justice system. And so we've had some great events. But it's also due to some of the support that this series has gotten here at the university. And I made a list of names because I don't want to leave anybody out. But my colleagues in advancement, specifically, Kirk Swinson, Michael McNamee, Kevin Fuller, Kay Waller, and Michelle Olson, they're the ones who really make these events happen. I just choose the book and show up 3 times a semester, but they're the ones who really make this event happen. So I especially want to thank all of them. So this semester at UNC Asheville, we have hosted a couple of writers. We had Ta-Nehisi Coates earlier in the spring. Then we had the United States Poet Laureate Ada Limon a few weeks later. And then just last week, I was with Charles Frazier for the launch of his new novel, The Trackers. And all that to say that I really appreciate them serving as the opening act for Dr. Benjamin Gilmer and myself. I think they were kind of like the acoustic bands before Pink Floyd takes the stage, right? To play the hits, and that's what we're going to do tonight, play the hits. But it's a great time to be involved in the literary arts here at UNC Asheville. And if you would like to become involved, either as a friend or as a participant, I would love to talk with you about that after tonight's event. And if you're really interested in donating to the university, perhaps to a cause like creative writing or creative writing scholarships, you can scan the QR code. I don't know how to do that. Maybe you do. Out there at the table, or talk to the people at the desk about supporting the university. And if 10 folks want to do that tonight, we have free copies of The Other Dr. Gilmer waiting for you for any gift that you would like to give the university tonight. So thank you in advance for doing that. So I want to take the time now to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Benjamin Gilmer. Dr. Benjamin Gilmer is a family physician and associate professor at the University of North Carolina School of Medicine and the Mountain Area Health Education Center's Family Medicine Residency Program. He is an international Albert Schweitzer Fellow and attended Davidson College, followed by medical studies at the Sorbonne in Paris, France, and East Carolina University. As the medical director for MAHEC's Rural Health Initiative and Rural Fellowship, he is passionate about advocating for global and rural health disparities. He has worked extensively in Central and South America and West Africa. Benjamin is committed to advancing medical education, point-of-care ultrasound, interprofessional collaboration, and inspiring students to pursue rural health. His advocacy work currently focuses on bringing media attention to the social injustice of mass incarceration. He is a former neurobiologist turned rural family doctor. He lives in Asheville. We got some neurobiology fans in the audience. She's like, I knew there was a reason I got dressed and came out to this event. I thought it was going to be a literary reading, and now they're talking about neurobiology. Benjamin lives in Asheville with his wife, Deirdre, their 2 children, Kai and Luya, and their dog, Prince Peanut Butter, right here in town. Friends, Dr. Benjamin Gilmer.
Thank you, Wiley.
You're welcome. Thank you for being here.
You didn't know that you're all here to see an air guitar competition tonight between...
That's what it's going to devolve into. It's going to be straight air guitar. So I want to give a little background. Some of y'all might have read my essay on the Common Word site, and if you didn't, now you don't have to. But I first became familiar with The Other Dr. Gilmer and Benjamin Gilmer when I think it was emailed to my UNC Asheville email address. Hey, I've got this book. Do you want to see it? And I thought, probably not, but sure. Because you're probably experiencing that now. People are asking you for blurbs. You're getting those kinds of requests.
Not yet.
Nope. Okay. Well, will you blurb my next book? That's actually why I brought you here. Will you blurb my next? I'm writing a nonfiction thing. It's about a rural doctor. And so I thought, I think you had sent me the PDF, and I thought, well, I'll just read the first 10 pages. And I'm at our office that my wife and I rent, and I read 10 pages, and then I thought, oh, no, I'll read 20 pages. And then I think I packed my laptop away and went somewhere for lunch and read on my laptop during lunch, and then I came home and back to the office and kept reading. And that's the kind of book it is. And I thought, well, I've already read it. And you said you had sent it to Charles Frazier as well. And so Charles and I were talking about it. He was like, can you believe this book? And I was like, no, can you believe this book? And so then I'm telling my wife, you are not going to believe this book. And so it was just such a wonderful experience reading it. But that being said, I want to talk at the top. And for those of you who haven't read it, I kind of want to walk through the book the way that we might walk through your experience of becoming a physician and then finding yourself in the situation you found yourself in. So the book really starts at the Cane Creek Clinic down in Fletcher. But what was your medical experience before arriving in Cane Creek? What kind of things were you doing?
Can I just firstly say thanks to UNC Asheville for having me and for Drs. Laura Bailey and Meadows for their amazing talks. Are they here tonight? The amazing talks that were preceded this event. So I came to Asheville. We had a house up in Avery County. My parents did years ago. And I wanted to come back desperately. Deirdre was living in New York City, and we were sort of torn between Asheville and New York City. But I really wanted to
Very similar places.
And I was begging Dr. Steve Holkauer back in the back to allow me to come to residency here. So we came here so that I could do residency. Deirdre gave up her career of dance in New York City. And yeah, so we plunged into Mission Hospital in Mayheck, learning to become a family doctor. So that was what brought us here. And once you come here, you don't want to leave because you want to eventually retire here and become part of this Ollie and keep being a student. I didn't know what Ollie was for a long time. Like, everyone's talking about Ollie. Like, what? Now I know what Ollie is, and what an amazing gift.
Well, can you talk a little bit about your medical experience abroad and how that affected your work in a rural clinic like Cane Creek?
Well, I sort of grew up in between Charlotte and Western Tennessee, and I went to medical school exclusively to do urban emergency medicine. That was my work. For 10 years, I worked in the emergency department. My mentors were emergency medicine people. I hadn't yet met Steve Hulkauer. And then I decided to take a year off during medical school and go to Africa. This was after discovering the rural communities of eastern North Carolina and the extreme health disparities that they have there, which are very similar to the health disparities we have here. So east of 95, east of Morganton, we share a lot in common. And during that year abroad, I discovered what full spectrum family medicine could be. I had never seen that before, and what it means to be part of a community, to take care of babies and deliver babies and take care of women. It was just an eye-opening experience. And then I learned that there's a whole specialty that's devoted to doing those things, which also implies advocating. And so that's family medicine.
Sure. What was the Cane Creek Clinic like when you arrived? What kind of environment and community did you find when you first arrived? And you went to Cane Creek in 2009. So what was it like when you arrived there?
So the Cane Creek Clinic, which I don't know if any patients out there, is a beautiful little home, isn't it? It's a little tiny 1,200 square foot home that used to be a home and was a former family medicine clinic that had died, and Mayheck took the risk to resuscitate it and to bring it back because the community at that time didn't have a medical home in the Fairview Valley there, in the Cane Creek Valley. And so it's a simple little house with simple little, there are 5 of us doctors who take care of that community, but it's, in the book I write about discovering what my office was, which is sort of it was an old rustic desk with the old carpet surrounded by a room that needed a lot of work and carpet that hadn't been changed since the beginning of the building, with a beautiful field. Now, previously there was corn, some years it's soybeans, but this year we have cows in the back. So it's a gorgeous little place, but it's very symbolic of our mission at Mayheck, which is to take care of rural communities.
So how long were you at Cane Creek before you began learning about the man who had preceded you, Dr. Gilmer, Dr. Vince Gilmer?
The very first day.
And what was that experience like, and what kinds of things were you hearing?
So I didn't really know what I was getting into during the interview. Dr. Hulkauer was participating in interviewing me for the job. I didn't know many of the details of who the other Dr. Gilmer was, but I think my second patient was one of his. And I'd sort of put blinders on. I was just trying to become a father and husband and survive and take care of my first patients by myself. So it's a year where there's a very steep learning curve. But then the patients started talking. They wanted to share the story of this man because they believed in who he was. They believed that he was a great man and physician. And I had a simple bias, which was that he brutally killed his father, and I just wasn't committing myself to that discovery. I was just trying to do my job. And then the stories kept building, and they kept building, and they kept building, and there was this collage of very confusing stories that were, circulating in my mind about who this person was. And it was confusing. It was really confusing beginning to a career because of the dissonance of imagining the brutality of who this person was, the monster that my mind was imagining, and this doctor that my patients I mean, they wanted me to be more like him. And that was very confusing.
So, for those of y'all who don't know and haven't read the book yet, the person whose footsteps Benjamin was walking in started this clinic and had really served the people of this community very well and very wholeheartedly and very professionally and very, very, very kindly. And was it 2004, committed this heinous act where he murdered his father. And something that I found really refreshing in the book is that you admit how much the reality of that crime terrified you. Can you talk a little bit about what it felt like? And you had a really creepy interaction with the patient that you put in the book is deeply unnerving. A guy comes in, it seems like just intent on messing with you. But can you talk about the real fear that you were facing, being in that position, being new, knowing about this grisly crime, knowing about the shared last name? How did it feel to be in those shoes?
I tried to not pay attention to it for the first year or so, but then I had a patient who came to me and said, "Oh, you look like the other Dr. Gilmer. And did you know he's getting out of prison? And have you ever imagined that you sort of took over his life and you've assumed his riches? You're doing what he wants to be doing right now. I can only imagine that he would come after you." And I recently heard that he's getting out of prison. And so that was a real turning point for me where the denial phase was over. Yeah. And we as a family had to sort of reckon with, like look at me, like I went to Davidson College. Like I'm a privileged guy who never intersected with the prison system before, never intersected with people who, I don't think I've ever met anybody who committed a crime in my life before.
You have tonight, Benjamin. I got warrants.
So it was a new experience that led to a certain degree of paranoia, imagining, what it could be like to be close to this murder. And I was slowly getting closer and closer to this man in his life, realizing that we were going to collide at some point. And also realizing that I was responsible for my family, that I needed to be, protect them. My brothers were telling me to leave Asheville, to move, to come to Nashville, Tennessee, and it was a scary time.
I'm just trying to paint kind of a psychological portrait of what you were going through in that moment. I mean, here you are, your first permanent job out of medical school, really, kind of doing the work that you dreamed of doing, the irony of following in the footsteps of a man who shares your last name, the fear of knowing he had committed this grisly murder, where you're also trying to square the reports that his former patients are giving to you about how great he is and how they wish you were more like him, perhaps. Meantime, deeply afraid, am I crossing a boundary that's going to set this guy off? And if he is getting out of jail, what does the future hold for me? And so it's just a fraught moment in the book. And I want to say novel because it reads like fiction. But I will say that it is too unbelievable to be fiction, the things that happen in the book and really the setup. I was telling someone tonight that if one of my students in a fiction writing class wrote this, I'd be like, it's too unbelievable. It's too unlikely. Nobody's going to believe that. But one of the things that feels so impossible, Benjamin, which is obviously possible because it transpired, how you went from the shaky ground of fearing Vince Gilmer to eventually reaching out to Vince Gilmer. What was that emotional, intellectual process like, knowing I'm just going to reach out to him. I'm just going to clear the air. I'm just going to go for it. What was that? What was the journey of making that decision?
I mean, in our lives, we all confront like a certain level of brokenness. And there was a period of time where life was challenging and fragile, and we as a family sort of realized that you can't keep doing this. Like, you have to discover who he is, or you have to either give it up or confront it. And so we huddled as a family and decided that, this is something we're gonna, I had to know. And as a neurobiologist, I was becoming deeply curious about what was happening to this man, what had happened to this man's brain. Something had clearly happened to him. And so we jumped in, and at first I had received a call from a journalist from NPR, Sarah Koenig, who works for a podcast, This American Life, who asked if I wanted to do a story, and I said, "Are you crazy? Like, that's the last thing I would ever want to do, is to put this out in the media." And a few months went by, and I realized that, I needed a partner, to help me do this. So together we sort of joined forces, and Sarah forced us to write that letter, to write the first letter to him. And it was a really scary experience, because I was waiting and waiting and waiting to get this letter, not knowing how this man would respond. And then after reading it, realizing that this person was probably not, well, I didn't know what he was at that point, but he was seeming to be more of a victim in my mind than the cold-blooded murderer that the judge had described him as. The judge said he was nothing more than a cold-blooded murderer and deserved the harshest punishment that the state of Virginia could afford, the Commonwealth of Virginia could afford. And so they put him in prison for life.
Well, let's talk about some of the things that were sticking in your mind. In the weeks leading up to the murder, Vince's behavior was different. Vince had been in an automobile accident. Vince had taken himself off some medication. Vince was exhibiting strange behavior. Can you talk a little bit about, once you began kind of looking past the crime and looking at Vince as a person who seemed to, and it goes back to the portrayal that the patients gave you of him, to try to make sense of how that break happened. Can you talk about some of the things that accompanied the murder, like some of the behaviors?
So it's interesting, if you look at a story or a person through a clinical lens, which is that's the only way we know how to look at people in the clinic, you see things that are very different. Like, it's easy to separate the crime from the symptoms, and all of these things these stories that you just mentioned. This was the portrait of Vince Gilmer that I was hearing back, and so I was very interested in seeing what formed the portrait of his mind, and what were the things that a psychiatrist like Dr. Steve Bowie in the background, who was part of this story very much, what formed this man? What were the elements that form all of us? What are the elements that form pathology? I mean, this is psychiatry. What was his history that brought him to that deadly day? And so each of these stories played a role in terms of unfolding the layers of his brain, whether it be coming off an SSRI, an antidepressant medication, which can cause delusions, whether it be the traumatic brain injury, which I thought he had because I'm a neurobiologist. And that was my master's thesis. So I was so biased and blinded because I thought that's what had happened to him, that he had this traumatic brain injury. It had altered his emotional lability, and things were starting to change. Or was he just having a midlife crisis? Or was this an accumulation of the stress and PTSD that he had been experiencing his whole life? Because I was beginning to hear stories that maybe he had been abused by his father, none which were corroborated.
He was also a veteran.
And he was also a veteran. There were more than a trilogy of things that were coming into play to form this very complex picture of this man who was still surviving and seeing patients. Yeah.
And so you write this letter to Vince, and you wait and you wait and you wait. And I won't talk about the unsettling Christmas party surprise that your staff pulled on you. I'll let the readers experience that for themselves. But Vince eventually responds to you. And, you know, you're familiar with Vince through photographs. You're familiar with Vince through stories from his patients. But the letter you got back did not seem like it could have possibly been written by the man that you had heard about and seen video of and photographs of. Can you talk about the letter?
The letter was a madman's scrawl, literally. It looked like a kindergarten, or maybe my writing. But it was indecipherable. And at the very bottom, I could read, "Please help." I could see words like aggression, violent, "please help." And so that was his first call. It was his first opportunity to call out. He had been visited by only 2 people in a decade during his first decade of incarceration: his mother, and me, and Sarah Koenig. So it was, for him, it was an opportunity to reach out for the first time.
And so can you talk about then, and I may be getting some of this out of sequence, but for the purposes of this evening, can you talk about then looking at this letter and how that compelled you to go back and look at the trial, to look at the interviews, to look at, because Vince represented himself at his trial, and look at some of the choices he made. Look at, the accusation of malingering at his trial, which I did not know was a legal frame for faking it, right? For faking a mental illness. Can you talk about the process of going into those trial transcripts and what you discovered?
So it was a really fun experience, firstly, to be working alongside of Sarah Koenig, because she was sort of teaching me the ropes on like what a journalist does.
Sarah Koenig did Serial, for those of you who might know that podcast.
And so it was a kind of adventure going to the courthouse, looking at all these things. But in the original draft of the book, I wrote 4 chapters about the trial, because it was such a farcical, unbelievable, like, merciless trial that really was not constitutional. And it was an embarrassment to see a man who had fired his lawyers because he was very unstable at the time to represent himself for his own murder trial, and to do it so poorly. It should be a signal to any jury judge that if you're representing yourself, something is not working well up there. So it was an experience it was a deep experience to see what his mind was like in that moment. And his mind was very disturbed. Yeah.
And there were several instances you found in the transcript where he would say things like, "I feel like a jellyfish is stinging my brain." And there were instances where he would say, "I need to be evaluated. I need to be evaluated." And they refused.
He begged the judge to have another psychiatric evaluation. He was never evaluated by a psychiatrist or a forensic psychiatrist. He was evaluated by a psychologist. So he never had the opportunity to be evaluated for the court's purpose by a psychiatrist. And he was describing the symptoms that he would continue to describe for the next 18 years in very specific terms, like, I feel like a jellyfish is stinging my brain. So he was spelling it out to everyone in a way that later my medical student would be able to decipher exactly what the diagnosis was, after Steve Bowie, Dr. Bowie in the back, who was the first person to think of the diagnosis, which maybe we shouldn't talk about tonight if you haven't read the book. Yeah.
So eventually you and Sarah Koenig go up to, is it Brushy Mountain? What's the name of the prison?
Wallens Ridge.
Wallens Ridge. Brushy Mountains, James Earl Ray, I think. I'm getting my super complexes confused. But you go up to Wallens Ridge, and you're both terrified because you don't know what you're going to find. And can you talk about your first impressions of Dr. Vince Gilmer when you visited him in prison for the first time?
So I firstly sort of had my first panic attack. Like, before we went into the prison, I discovered that I was unable to write my name. It was a really bizarre experience where my handwriting was like shaky and had to take a moment. And what we saw that day was, we didn't know what we were going to see that day, but what we saw that day was this frail, elderly appearing man who shuffled out, who had this very strange gesticulating movements in his hands and in his face, these dyskinesias in his face. And he was stumbling over his words, and his cognition was slow, and he was desperate, and he was hungry, and he was starved. So it didn't appear that this was a person who could be possibly malingering or faking these symptoms, which people had believed for 10 years in prison. They still do today, some folks in the prison. He was faking these symptoms. And so I decided to bandito a psychiatrist into the prison, that would be Dr. Bowie, and asked him if he could join me coffee, and then asked, hey, what do you think about going to the Supermax prison next weekend to help me determine if this first-degree murderer is a sociopath, or is he actually suffering from another illness, possibly neurologic, certainly psychiatric. What do you think? I'll get you some donuts.
Well, if it makes you all feel better, he eventually takes his wife and children up there for Thanksgiving. And they're here tonight somewhere, so thank them for that kindness. So some really shocking things happen, and I don't want to give away those things tonight for the audience members who have not read the book, although it seems like very few have not. But you had to clear some incredible bureaucratic hurdles to get him the treatment and evaluation that not only he deserves, but we all deserve. Every human deserves the simple rights of humanity. What was it like to fight the system from that much of a distance, the prison system, right, in a different state? What was that experience like?
It was an act of studentship. I didn't know. Sarah Koenig, after we visited the prison that first last time, she had to sign off because she had discovered this new story, the story of Anand Syed, and which later became Serial, which was a discovery actually from our story. Like one of the lawyers we worked with told her about that. So I was kind of on my own with the family, trying to sort out what do we do here? Like, what is my role here, thinking that this man has this neurologic and psychiatric illness, thinking that, well, clearly he shouldn't be in prison. Like, how could it be? And also thinking naively that how hard could it be to get someone out of prison who has a clear diagnosis that explains everything, that really proves that he should never have set one foot into this prison, that he should have been in the hospital from the very beginning. We had an ally from inside the walls of the prison, a lovely man.
A rare ally.
A rare gem of a forensic psychiatrist who had been practicing forensic psychiatry for 50 years, who said, of course this guy is not malingering. That is garbage. And so together we formed a team, a sort of secret team from the inside of the prison, and he enabled us to do testing on Ben's for the first time, to get genetic testing, and we had a lot of resistance. And then This American Life podcast came out, and then the judge who convicted Vince Gilmer on Saturday after the podcast came out called the governor, who was soon to be indicted and later exonerated by the Supreme Court for embezzlement, called him and said, we need to get this guy out of here. The governor then communicated with the Department of Corrections. The Department of Corrections descended upon the prison on Sunday morning and tried to get the psychiatrist fired. So I was beginning to learn how the system worked. Like it was very political, it was very personal, and I was realizing that it was going to take much more than a single lawyer. It was going to take Wiley Cash and an event, it was becoming a political act, an act of learning about what advocacy is, and that advocacy goes beyond writing a single letter, that it was going to take commitment.
And I think commitment's a good word, and it took commitment that I don't know that I could muster in the ways that you did, and in the ways that your family, supported. And one thing that I really appreciated about the book, Benjamin, we talked earlier in the semester about the ethics of true crime, and in your book, you never sensationalized the murder. You talked about the facts of the murder, and you never centered yourself in the story. We never saw the story as being valid because it resonated with you or with your experience. And we talked a little bit about that at dinner tonight. But one thing that you were really honest about that I found refreshing was how hard this was. The reality of how hard it was on you as a physician. You've still got your patients back at Cane Creek. You've got a family. You had young children at the time. And can you talk about the reality of the toll that this experience took on you, and kind of the evolution of the experience from excitement at a new job to uncertainty to insecurity to fear to, what was that experience like, the roller coaster of that?
Did Deirdre ask you to ask that question?
She said, get him on the record.
It was really hard. I mean, I didn't know at each step in the journey, there was something new. There was a new turn. There was a new experience. I guess I have a personality that's sort of, that zeroes in on challenge, that zeroes in on dopamine reward for doing something. But I didn't realize that the commitment that it would take, or the sacrifices that it would take. For the family especially, but sacrifices that Vince's mother would need to do. The sacrifices of the lawyers who became a part. And as a character in the book, it felt sort of silly for me to describe the sacrifices I was experiencing, because they were nothing in comparison to what the trauma that Vince experiences every day, or the trauma of living with sexual trauma, living in a prison where people think you're a malingerer and just a murderer, and he's a man who's floridly psychiatrically ill, who's trying to understand himself. So each step was a new boulder to move, and there have been a lot of boulders. We've had to boulder through 3 different governors of Virginia. We've had to boulder through escapades of CNN, who did a really sort of a terrible job with a documentary that really left in people's minds this diagnosis of malingering. It's been a series of challenges that's really tested all of us.
And that's what I found so refreshing, is that you never lost sight of Vincent's humanity, but we never lost sight of yours either. And it was a very close experience as a reader. And what I found so interesting was that you inherited the Cane Creek Clinic from Vince. You inherited patients from Vince. And then, you both had treated these patients with such care and determination. And I think it was that practice that led you to treat Vince with that same care and determination. So you're really living out your physician's oath throughout this book and throughout this experience. And do you feel comfortable updating us on the situation now, or what your role in now is, or the challenges that you face with Vince? Or?
Sure. So the first lesson that I've learned is that you have to fight like hell to get someone out of prison. And there's no mechanism to do it. There's not an easy mechanism to do it. So the update has been a series of challenges. And we realized that in order for the governor to actually do it, to grant him clemency, there had to be a larger story. So the book was written in large part for Governor Ralph Northam, who was a neurologist, who we believe the stars had aligned and placed this neurologist governor in our path. And in June of 2022, he rejected our clemency petition. And we were floored. We expected that he would do it. The book hadn't come out yet, and we, just a month before the end of his term, Penguin Random House enabled me to release like pre-release copies to the governor's office. And so we dropped a whole box in there. And we had been building little allies too. And on his last day in office, 2 weeks later, he decided to grant him clemency. So that was the first big win after really a 10-year battle. I thought we were done at that point. I thought we all believed we had mission accompli, that we had come to the end of this journey. And then I learned there's a bigger struggle, which is the struggle of mental health in America, which we've all been probably reading a lot about this year. We're starting to learn that 25% of the world's incarcerated people live in our neighborhoods. That 10 times more people with mental illness live in prisons than they do in mental hospitals. That 40% of prisoners, incarcerated people, have severe mental illness, and there's nowhere for them to go. I mean, there's nowhere for us to go. The paucity of resources is tremendous. So you would think that a clemency granted man with a podcast with 20 million listeners and now a book released and a movie in progress would enable a place to take vents, and it hasn't happened yet. There's a lot of risk aversion when you're talking about placing a patient like Vince, who's also a complicated psychiatric and neurologic patient. So it takes a lot to move a patient like that into a secure psychiatric facility, which was the only thing we were asking for, to go from prison to a hospital. That was the clemency petition. That was the ask. And that he would go to a hospital and then later be transferred to a beautiful facility like the Black Mountain Home, Neurobehavioral Center in Black Mountain, or the NC Veterans Home in Black Mountain, or Broughton Hospital for a period of time, or Mission Hospital for a period of time. No one has stepped up to help us do that. After months of negotiation, after Vince has now served more time in prison as a free man, maybe than any other person in our history.
So he's been in prison as a free man since January of 2021, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
22.
January 2022. So yeah, the story continues. And you've done an incredible amount of work, and you've raised an incredible amount of money and made some stunning allies in this fight. And it continues. And I think that doing events like this and having an audience like this, maybe Glenn Youngkin's brother-in-law is in the audience right now. And once they get done fighting the real enemy in the church and the school library, they'll get on this issue as soon as they can. But would you take some questions from the audience?
Love to.
Yeah. Does anybody have any questions about the book or about Vince or about writing or rural medicine?
This is the work of the book, is being in conversation with you all, so we can hash this out, so we can think about, why are we doing this? Why are we prosecuting the mentally ill in our country? Because it's going to take more than me. It's going to take more than Dr. Bowie. It's going to take more than law enforcement. It's going to take more than the governor, to turn this around. Oh, he knows everything. He's well engaged, and he would love to be here tonight. He would love to be here tonight. And
there were quite a few twists and turns where we thought he might be able to be here tonight.
We were hoping that this might be the first opportunity for him, if Mission Hospital had accepted him, that he would be here tonight. Yeah. So he's very cognizant. It's interesting, the disease he has is very, these patients do well when they're in non-threatening situations. And so he will do so much better when he's outside of the prison walls. His neurobiology will actually change from a epigenetic sort of way. Yes, sir. I mean, at some point, I really believe that the stars, or some divinity had put us together. So there was no giving up. We don't give up on our patients when they're sick. I mean, this is not a new fight. We fight these kind of battles all the time in family medicine, whether that be to get someone to a surgeon who doesn't have insurance, to get them the right medications if they can't afford them, to find them a behavioral health therapist if they have no insurance. These are not new battles. I mean, Vince's plight was definitely a big one, but you know, if I took the Hippocratic Oath, you can't just say, oh, I'm not going to, I'll accept the Hippocratic Oath with this patient, but not with this patient. There was, plus Vince was part of our family. I had this crying gene. It came from my father. All the Gilmers cry.
The first time I met Benjamin in person was at an event in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. It was kind of a showcase of authors who had new books out, and Benjamin was the last person to read, and I think you got 5 minutes in, and you said, "Here's the part I cry." And the whole room went, "Oh," and I thought, that dude's going to sell so many books tonight. I should have cried during my reading.
But this is a story that should make, I wanted everybody to cry in this book, yeah.
The live stream can't hear it. Yeah.
I'm just curious about privatized prisons versus state-run prisons, and which one is he in, and if that played a role in how hard it is to get somebody out because of privatization of prisons.
That would be a really good book, and there have been books written about that. But yes, yeah, thank you. So the same
And private hospitals.
the same comparison between I mean, this is part of the problem, right? States make money, private prisons make money off their prisoners being there for as long as possible, which is a very different paradigm compared to what they do in Norway, which is in the book I talk about a Norwegian supermax prison. Their goal is to get their prisoners out as fast as they can, to return dignity to those people. We haven't figured out this punishment and redemption element in our country, and it is tied to hospitals too. The same comparison could be made to a private hospital and a public hospital, but we have not figured this out. You would think that he's currently in a state-funded prison. It's the only psychiatrically centric prison in the whole Commonwealth of Virginia. And they didn't have a psychiatrist for about 5 years after they fired Dr. Anglicur in the book. If that tells you anything about the rehabilitative efforts that are happening there. And every prison is different. There are prisons that are doing good work in America. There are prisons that are doing horrific, traumatizing work. There are hospitals that are also contributing to traumatizing.
In the back here.
Thank you. Doctor, it's an amazing story. You began by saying tonight how much you appreciated Ollie and you'd like to be involved in this community at some point. One of the things folks in Ollie often do, because they've had 40, 50 years of career time, is sit occasionally in a quiet moment and think, did I use my time the best way I could have? Did I use my assets the best way? Did I use my entitlement to be most productive, to do something of value? And so I'm listening to all the challenges you have in rural health care. You've got a family, you've got a small practice, and you're stretched absolutely thin. I would have to believe you don't get enough sleep every night. And I'm thinking about all the hundreds, perhaps thousands of hours that you've dedicated to this sort of focused commitment, the word we've been using. Has it run around in your brain some in a quiet moment? Why am I spending all this time on this individual who has this really kind of, 4 standard deviations out from the norm of the problems I could address every day, setting and challenges, when perhaps my time might do a lot of good for a lot more people within my practice who have a lot of mental illness issues that no one's addressing. So I just curious if that's a thought that you've danced with.
That's a very good question. There's not a playbook for advocacy. Like there's nothing out there that helps people guide people's journeys towards advocacy or towards creative advocacy. And so we've been sort of fumbling through this process. I've been asking these questions too, like, what is the return on this investment? Well, for me, it was very personal to help this one man. But now we're sort of, I see this sort of pathway towards change or evolution as this sort of 5-step ladder that starts with curiosity, which is something I'm really committed to. And then you have to move into a period of a deep dive inquiry, which was this process of writing the book, which was the process of discovering events. And then you sort of get transformed along the way. And that was what happened to me when I went to the prison. And then you arrive at this place where you have this new experience or knowledge, and you have to sort of vision about what would be the most efficient way to make change. And that's kind of where I'm sort of stuck right now in terms of how do we do this together? What is my calling in this journey? Where should this book be utilized to make change? And so it's, I've been fumbling through and taking notes along the way, but I think that what I have learned is that change from this one man, that Vince is very symbolic of a much greater problem that we have in America. And the people resonate with him. They resonate with his story. I mean, that we had 20 million people who listened to the podcast, and people seem to be resonating with the book in a way that's personal. And so I feel like the calling for me in this journey has been to create sort of a gateway or an opportunity to learn about what an advocacy process looks like and how you might want to define your own.
I've actually read the book, and I found it to be an amazing story. And thank you for writing it. It was very captivating. One thing that struck me was obviously the similarity in your last name, the fact that Dr. Gilmer and Dr. Gilmer. And one thing that's sort of a theme throughout the book is how it might have been different if you were Dr. Smith instead of Dr. Gilmer. Do you think you would have gotten involved at the beginning to the extent that you did? How do you think things might have changed? Would he be here tonight if you were Dr. Smith?
I hope so. I mean, it would have been different, and there was...
You might have had less inquiry if it was Dr. Smith.
There would have been less connection to him. I mean, obviously, at some point, I felt like, oh my gosh, how many... do I really need to be slugged in the head with a 2x4 to realize that, oh my gosh, our paths have intersected here for a reason. It was kind of hard to not think that we were destined to intersect. But maybe it would have been different if you pay attention to your patient's stories, and this is what we love to do in family medicine, this is our niche, is to pay attention to people's stories. And if you do that, then it would have been impossible to not recognize that something was amiss, and that this man was a good man who was very ill.
Mm-hmm. Back here, Doc. So setting aside the story, which is a really extraordinary story, I found the book to be so compelling in terms of the writing of it. And I just wonder, other than being a liberal arts graduate, right, from Davidson, where did your writing talent come from? How did you cultivate it? What possessed you to take on the writing of a book, right? You're an accomplished guy. You didn't have to do that. What is it that moved you to do that?
There is no talent. I got a C- in my Davidson lit course. It was a tenacious act for me. I realized that this was what we had to do to achieve justice for Vince. It felt like a very important part of this political game that we were playing. And so I used to really love being in my right side of my brain. We all have two hemispheres, right? And the right side is often one that we forget. That which is the creative, that which is the awareness, that which is the exploratory, that which opens up possibilities. And so I tried writing, and Deirdre's laughing back there, because I practiced and practiced in a dark room for a while, got lots of feedback and lots of laughs. And I realized it was very hard. Like what Wiley does is extraordinary. To write fiction like that is extraordinary. So being a member of a team, I connected myself with someone who could be a coach. And so I got an amazing agent who was inspiring. This person represents like the many amazing authors, including Brian Stevenson, who wrote Just Mercy, who became sort of a mentor from afar, and went down to visit him and got lots of tips from him. But it was, writing is an act that you have to practice. And I'm nothing like this. He's a pro. Like I'm just a novice, but I enlisted help. I got a coach and got lots of editing. Had an amazing editor at Penguin Random House. And if you think that, like, there aren't that many solitary writers. I mean, there are genius solitary writers, but a lot of writing in nonfiction, it's sort of a team effort in many ways. Like that, there was a lot of red ink on those pages.
But you also told me tonight at dinner that you had mornings where you got up at 4:30 in the morning to work before you went in to the clinic to write.
There were a lot of early mornings, but it was an act of practice and trying to be open to feedback and making yourself vulnerable. Writing is a very vulnerable experience because you really put yourself out there, but it felt so, and I was so inspired to do it because we were running a race against the clock. Like before Vince died, like that's been my great paranoia, is that he's going to die before we settle this and never experience freedom again. So I was so motivated to do it, more motivated than you could imagine. Like I became obsessed to do it.
Question over here.
Because Vince is now a free man, in quotes, is he allowed to leave the prison on day visits or no?
He was in solitary confinement 2 months ago. He has no special privileges. There are correctional officers who still believe he's faking. There's some others who are more compassionate with him, for sure.
Is he getting adequate medication for his condition?
There are newer medications for Huntington's. He's not getting any Huntington's medications. And he's not available for a clinical trial. So that could happen when he gets out. So no, he's not getting any special treatment. Yeah.
You got the mic. Go ahead.
Thank you for your talk. I think one of the things you mentioned was like preconceptions and like the severity that it has downstream. And as a professor at UNC School of Medicine, how has this changed how you teach, and like how has this experience woven into your teaching style there?
Wow, that's a really good question. So I've learned a lot about preconceptions and bias, and I've uncovered a lot of my own preconceptions and bias. And when you think about the brain, the design of the brain, we are designed for preconceptions of bias. We live our lives through this sometimes very disturbed left hemisphere, which teaches us to follow these mantras, these like tracks through life. And it's a lot easier if we just believe these preconceptions and biases. It takes less effort for the brain to operate like that. So, this whole experience has challenged a lot of my biases, and it's made me more sensitive about the mentally ill, for one. Like, they're my favorite patients now are taking care of people who suffer from mental illness. But when you think about, like, what makes a person and what makes you uncover so much more if you can. It's almost an impossible feat to conquer your biases and preconceptions. You have to be really intentional about it. But I think as a teacher, like it's something that I talk about all the time. And I question my own self more often, more easily. And that's been a great teaching tool, I think, for me. But it's been a great personal growth tool for sure.
Hi, thanks. As a fellow family physician, Dr. Gilmer, I want to go back to the question about how you spend your life. And I'm very intrigued by your journey from a single human being to a social justice lens. And I wonder about our opportunity as doctors, but also our opportunity as everyone in this room, and how we think differently about the exposure to one person that can impact the rest of our lives.
Well, I think you know this well as a family doctor, that, advocacy and social justice happens with almost every patient sometimes. It just so happens that this advocacy journey has attracted a lot of media attention. So not to diminish the amazing things that you do in your exam rooms. It's all the same, really. This is an example that I pushed in one person's life to a degree that I never thought I would. But we do this so often in the clinic, don't we? Like with patients that we have to battle to get things done. We have to advocate, to have the appropriate care delivered to them because nobody else is oftentimes doing it. So I don't want to diminish all the amazing advocacy and social justice efforts. Sometimes we just don't label what we do, or what a social worker does, or what a nutritionist does, or what everybody in healthcare is in pursuit of advocacy and social justice. This just happened to be one that's garnered a lot of attention. Is that okay? Yeah.
I have two questions. One, who's playing you in the movie?
That question just came in online, so I'm glad you asked me.
You don't have to answer.
I don't know. The whole movie thing's kind of embarrassing.
But my serious question.
Brad Pitt. Stephen Hulkauer is going to play me in the movie.
My serious question is, the fact that he's been granted clemency, but he's still in prison, is there not a constitutional issue that could be approached, with those lawyer people that do that kind of thing? That aren't his constitutional rights being decimated?
You would think. You would think. The problem was in the clemency. The finalization of the clemency petition literally happened at midnight, the night before Governor Northam was leaving office. And so there were a flurry of 1,000 other things that were happening that night for the governor. And so that the way it was written was simply that I would be, as the guardian of Vince Gilmer, I would be responsible for getting him to a hospital. So what that single line did was it absolved any responsibility from the Commonwealth of Virginia. And they don't want to deal with him. They don't want him to be in their mental health system because then he's going to be there forever in their mind. They don't want him to be in the hospital that shares the parking lot with the prison. You can throw literally a baseball from the front steps of the prison to the front steps of the mental hospital, of which the psychiatrist there said, yes, this would be a good fit for him, of course. So it's very complicated like that. So then there's also a new governor in town in Virginia, and they don't want to look soft on crime. They don't want to aid and abet the release of this man, because some people still think he should be in prison forever, suffering. So yes, it is a constitutional issue, but because of the legal phrasing in the clemency petition, it absolves them of their responsibility. But you can't get someone into a state mental hospital from prison if you don't have the Department of Corrections and the Department of Mental Health collaborating together. And they refuse to do that. And it's really hard to get someone out of a state into another state directly from prison. You have to accept some risk, which is why we've discovered that many of the for-profit systems that we've targeted are just not willing to take that risk for PR reasons, for other reasons.
So, about how many people suffer from Huntington's disease? You already said it. You gave it away. I used to work with the Hereditary Disease Foundation in New York City, which is one of the two that are studying, or I think there are only two, studying Huntington's. And they did the seminal work in Venezuela with the village. But I forgot to ask when I was there how many people.
In the United States, it's about 4 to 10 per 100,000, but it's often underdiagnosed. Vince's father was never diagnosed. He was misdiagnosed as being a schizophrenic. So there were some commonalities in their symptoms. So a lot of people, a lot of Huntington's folks end up in prisons. They end up in the streets.
Interesting.
One of the correctional officers said, I knew he had Huntington's from the first day he walked in here. I was like, well, how did you know that? Well, because I've seen a bunch of Huntington's patients in here. And so they are often the destitute and the poor.
Did you ever find his sister?
His sister was murdered during his trial. So no, she's never been found again. And there was never a trial about her murder.
Wow. Didn't she have children? And that you were concerned about?
She did have children. Mm-hmm.
And did you find them?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they could choose to be tested or not if they.
Yes. It's a very hard choice.
Yeah.
Only about, if you have a risk of Huntington's disease, about 50% of people end up actually getting tested, which is a surprising number.
Arlo Guthrie went through that with his sister after their father died, whether to be tested or not. He finally did. I don't know if his sister did, but he did.
Yes.
He was clear.
That's right. Arlo's still alive today.
Maybe one more question if anybody else has any questions, or Kevin, if any more questions came in online. Let's see, we got, close it out.
Are you going to write another book? Do you have one underway?
My wife is cringing back there in the back. I had a beautiful experience writing this book. It was a real discovery of something that, I don't know, it was a beautiful experience. And now I've sort of seen, like, what a book can do, like how it can move people. So I one fine day, well, I would love to write another book. But, this is a story that, this is a story that only happens once in someone's life. Like, what story can I tell after this? But I've learned from this experience so many things that I become more curious about. And in medicine, we see lots of problems. We see the fragmentation of our civilization inside a little 1,200 square foot building. And so I learned now that advocacy can be done through writing, through media. It's a very important part of the advocacy journey. So if a story comes that I feel like needs to be told, I would love to tell it one day, if my wife gives me permission.
That's a great place to close.
I love you, Deirdre.
Thank you all so much for coming. You've been a great audience. And I'm gonna let him sneak out and go ahead and take a seat out at the book table. Benjamin, if we can let him clear the room, he's gonna be out there signing books, so you can grab a book if you don't have one. And if you want to make a gift to the university, there's a little table set up out there. We've got 10 free copies of the book we'd love for you to have your name on. So thank you all so much for coming, and we really, really appreciate it.
And thank you to Wiley Cash, please, who, it takes a special person, I think, to pick up a random person's book and to launch into it and then to become such an advocate and mentor for me. So thank you.
There's space for you so you don't get stopped.